Good evening, everyone. I am Jackie Martin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Riley Institute. I don't have time really to tell you all a lot about the work of the Riley Institute. I just would like to say that we are Dick Riley's institute, and Dick's commitment to, of course, Dick Riley, former U.S. Secretary of Education, former two-term governor of South Carolina, his principles of equity and access animate and inform everything that we do at the Riley Institute, and we are proud to be in that role here at Furman University. But what brings all of us here tonight is the Institute's commitment to broadening student and community perspectives about issues that are critical to the progress of the state. Our speaker this evening, Mr. Jeffrey Ball, has been here with us for 3 full days of interactions with students and faculty as part of a Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellows Program. He is our 19th Woodrow Wilson Scholar to join us here at the Riley Institute and at Furman. Dr. Ken Peterson is going to tell you a little bit more about Jeff in just a second. But just a bit about the Woodrow Wilson program. This program brings prominent journalists, diplomats, statesmen, and other leaders and experts to campuses to engage in dialogue across campus with students, faculty, and in this case, community members. Previous Woodrow Wilson fellows who have joined us here at Furman include New Jersey Governor and EPA head Christine Todd Whitman, former Maine Governor John Baldacci, U.S. Ambassadors Thomas Boyett and Robin Sanders, and leading public opinion pollster Peter Hart, just to name a few of the folks that have joined us here. Some of the students that are here tonight have been lucky enough to engage with Mr. Ball in their classes, or perhaps in a small group or a meeting or meal with them, and I know that you all would have enjoyed that experience tremendously from what I have seen of Jeff's interaction with students. I should note that tonight's presentation is part of Furman's year-long exploration of climate change. This is a partnership with the Shy Center, with the Institute for the Advancement of Community Health, and the Riley Institute, and we've partnered to present events over the year and across the campus. On Jeff's topic tonight, I would just say this. I think it is increasingly the case that the most important economic, political issues of our day are intersecting in the international marketplace, and that international business leaders are influencing outcomes on these issues as much or more as our policymakers and government leaders. I hope the students here tonight will listen to Mr. Ball's remarks with an ear to your futures, whether your future is in policymaking or commerce or science or wherever you find yourself, and think about how you can engage in these issues, how you can help drive progress. I think that we, the adults who are currently in charge of the world, have made a rare mess of things, and we need your help to step up and make things happen. We do need you. So it is my task to introduce the introducer. Here this evening to introduce our speaker is Furman's Dean of Faculty, Dr. Ken Peterson. Dr. Peterson chaired the Economics Department for 12 years, and he was the director of the Urban Studies program at Furman for 8 of those years. He has been widely honored for his outstanding commitment and work with mentoring students, and is a key driver of this grand experiment of ours, the Furman Advantage. Please welcome Dr. Ken Peterson.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. Before I introduce Jeff, I just have to give a quick shout out to our Riley Institute folks. So Don, Jackie, Jill is here somewhere, Summer, and to our whole Riley team, to our Riley Advanced team as well. We are so proud of you, and we thank you for the work that you do every day. Jeffrey Ball joins us tonight from Stanford, as you know. And I'm going to give you an introduction for him in just a second. But before we do that, can I please ask you to just check your cell phone one more time to make sure that it's turned off. I am the worst offender, by the way, of this, and so it's an issue near and dear to my heart. So just take a minute, make sure it's off. After Jeffrey speaks, we're going to have some time for questions, so you might think during the talk about what you might want to ask. If you'd like to ask a question during the question period, please raise your hand high, and we will have an advanced team member bring a microphone to you so that your question can be heard. It would also be helpful when you stand, if you would stand when you ask your question so we can see where the question is coming from in the group. Students, we are counting on you to be the main questioners tonight. Jeffrey is used to tough questions, and he has certainly asked his share of tough questions to other people, so I think it's good if we give it back to him tonight. That would be wonderful. So, Jeffrey Ball, scholar, newspaper editor, lecturer, globetrotter. Jeff has traveled, written, and shared his extensive research and expertise with PBS, NPR, MSNBC, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and The Atlantic, not to mention reporting from more than 15 countries and 5 continents. Tonight, it is a pleasure that he is here to share it with you all on our beautiful Furman campus. Since 2011, Jeff has been based at Stanford, and he is a lecturer and scholar in residence there in the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance, which is a joint initiative of the university's law and business schools. It's there that he leads an exciting project exploring the globalization of clean energy that could have positive implications for our planet. And he's not only in the trenches with Stanford students, he is at home among them, literally. Jeff and his family, along with their dogs, live under one roof with 300 students in the Sustainable Living Dorm. Tonight, Jeffrey Ball is here as part of Furman's year-long exploration of climate change, and his address is entitled Sharp Fights and Hard Lessons in the Global Race to Cleaner Energy. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Ball. We're really looking forward to his comments tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. Hi there. Wow, a full house. Thank you. I'm supposed to turn this button and make it green. Can you now hear me? Excellent. So you know what I'm going to say at the start, but I actually really mean it. Thank you, thank you, thank you very much. I've had the privilege of participating in the Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellows Program for 10 years, which makes me a really old guy. And through this program, I have the honor of going once or twice, typically a year, and spending 3 or 4 days at a university, at a college around the country. And I get to talk to students in classes, and I get to have lunch and dinner with students, and I get to give a talk like this. And it's immensely ego gratifying to stand up in front of a crowd of people, so thank you for gratifying my ego. But way more important than that, it's just an incredible privilege to get to talk to groups of interested students from around the country, and their interests and their passions and their opinions differ across the country, as you would imagine. This is not a line. You guys, men and women here at Furman who are students here, are exceptional. You all are incredibly thoughtful, incredibly interested. I've been blown away in the classes the last 2 days by your preparation and by the depth of your creativity and your thought. So it's a real pleasure to come to a place where one feels valued when one's coming, and I feel valued here. So thanks very much. I appreciate it. Okay, so enough of this happy stuff. Listen, I want to just say thank you very quickly to everyone at the Riley Institute, to Jill and Jackie and Summer and Don. I want to say thank you to George Shields. Thank you to various faculty members who have hurt their productivity by having me in their class the last couple of days. Jeffrey Habron, Mark Stone, Joni Tevis, Karen Allen, Ruth Aronoff, and Kate Kaup so far, and more tomorrow. And thank you most of all to those of you who are students here, and some of you, I guess, who's a student here who's been in a class that I've been in over the last couple of days? Excellent, so thank you guys very much. So we're going to talk about climate change tonight, and we're going to talk about renewable energy, and we're going to talk sort of about energy more broadly. But before we talk, and I'm going to talk for about maybe 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then I'm going to be quiet, and we're going to have a conversation. And I want to reiterate what you heard a minute ago, which is please ask questions. I will feel like a total failure if I'm up here yakking for a half an hour and I've done nothing to confuse you or incite you or anger you or I said confused. So please ask me questions and push back, because it means you're actually listening and thinking, particularly the students among you. You guys get first dibs. So I want to just tell you about who I am, sort of beyond the resume, and I really appreciate the really kind introduction. We just had a wonderful dinner with the community of scholars And what I essentially said to them was, forget all the resume stuff, take risks in life. Don't just sort of decide on a path at age 20 or 22 and stick with it and feel like you have to stick with it because you're too scared to change paths. And so what I want to tell you here in an abbreviated form is that I've changed paths a lot in life, and I didn't anticipate I would, but for the purposes of the substance of tonight's conversation, I got bitten with the journalism bug when I was about 15 in public high school in Potomac, Maryland. And I'll spare you the details, but I angered the principal of my high school, and it was an intoxicating feeling. And I basically never went back. And I majored in college in history, but really what I majored in was the school paper. I spent about 60 hours a week on the school paper as editor my junior year, and again was just sort of confirmed in love of journalism. And so while a lot of my friends went off to make a lot of money on Wall Street or in white shoe law firms or getting much greater credibility than I did by getting PhDs and going to august institutions to teach, I went out into the trenches to be a reporter. And I thought when I graduated from college that the New York Times would have the good sense to hire me, and the New York Times disagreed. And in fact, I couldn't get a job when I graduated from college, and it was the recession of 1990. Those of you with gray hair will remember. And I couldn't get a job, and so I went to France, and I lived in France for about 4 months, and then, which was a lot of fun. And then I came back, and I sent out a bunch of but this was before the internet. Those of you in firm, those are firm and ties, is that right? Yeah. This was before the internet, so I actually sent out letters, and I think somewhere I still have the pile of rejections that I got. The best one was from a newspaper in Colorado, and it said something like, "Dear Mr. Ball, thank you very much for your application. We have aspirations of becoming a major national newspaper of consequence, therefore we're not going to hire you." I'm not making it up. So anyway, I ended up in a state I had never been to, in a city I probably couldn't locate on the map, Corpus Christi, Texas, which is a fascinating news town in South Texas, maybe a 2 hours drive north of the Mexican border, full of amazing stories. I met a woman who's now my wife. I was there for about a year. I then moved to another newspaper not far from here, the Charlotte Observer. And my wife, who was at the time a reporter, worked in the Rock Hill Bureau of the Observer, so not too far from here. And I was at the Observer for a couple of years, and then I moved to the Wall Street Journal, and felt very lucky to do that, and spent 15 years at the Wall Street Journal. And I'll speed this up, but for the purposes of what we're going to talk about tonight, I spent 5 years. I was in Atlanta for the Journal initially for a couple of years, and then I spent 5 years in the Detroit Bureau of the Journal writing about the automotive industry, and then moved to Texas and spent 7 years in the Dallas Bureau of the Journal covering Exxon and oil and energy more broadly. And in the context of writing about cars and oil and energy, got very interested in this thing that was beginning to be discussed 15 years ago called climate change. And I want to just, because Jackie pointed this out, the extent to which globalization is really important and business is really important, and I'll just be even more blunt. This is all about money. And I got into this not because I wanted to save the planet, because I wouldn't have told you really that I was that very interested in the environment. I got into this because I wanted a juicy story. And I had the good fortune in my kind of mid to late 20s to encounter, through a series of events that I won't bore you with here, the beginning of mass movement of money around the question of how the world's attempt to deal with climate change was going to affect not the glaciers and not the politicians in Colombia or Washington, but major international corporations. It was pretty clear that this was going to go straight to the bottom lines of the biggest companies in the world. And I worked for the Wall Street Journal, and that was a Wall Street Journal story in my mind. And so I went back to New York and was lucky enough to persuade editors at the Journal to kind of carve out a big chunk of my time to let me develop what in the news business we call a beat. That is an area of focus on the business of the environment, the business of climate change. I was not going in this to prove a point. I really did not have an ideology. I'd like to think I still don't have an ideology. I think, as you will see over the next half hour, I have a point of view, but I think that's different from an ideology. And it's been a wild and fun and fascinating ride. I've had the great privilege of, as you heard, going around the world a lot to write, and I'm going to kind of take you inside, if you'll indulge me a little bit, and read you some of that stuff tonight. But this, for me, is all about the movement of money. So I'm now at Stanford and do what, to my mind, is gratifying academic work focusing on China, and have been to China about a dozen times in the last few years, and still continue to write journalistically about energy and the environment. So now let's kind of dig in, and I want to call to your attention two events from the past 10 days. One of them I'm pretty sure you've heard of. Some of you may have been there. The other event I bet you haven't heard of. The first event was this past Saturday, the marches around the world having to do with gun control in the wake of the shootings in Florida. Why do I mention that in a conversation about climate change and energy? We are still in this world early in watching how all this is going to play out, but already the groundswell that the response to Parkland has engendered is beginning to change the behavior of major companies in this country. It's causing some of them to stop selling certain kinds of guns. And it's causing politicians to change their behavior too. We will see, whether you like this or not, how far this goes, but it is causing CEOs and politicians to reconsider what they believed to be unchangeable truths about our society and about the marketplace. So hold that thought. The other event occurred last Thursday when something called the International Energy Agency. Has anyone heard of the International Energy Agency? Right? The International Energy Agency is an organization based in Paris, which basically is conventional wisdom on the global energy scene. And the IEA, as it's known, sent out an email that landed in my inbox, and it reported what happened to greenhouse gas emissions in 2017. And what happened to greenhouse gas emissions in 2017? Does anyone know? They went up. They went up for the first time in 4 years. So for 3 years, greenhouse gas emissions had been flat, and we will talk about what greenhouse gas emissions are in a moment, but they've been flat, and then they went up. Why did they go up? 2 reasons, according to the IEA. They rose because coal consumption was rising, particularly in Asia, and hold on to that thought about Asia. And they rose because energy efficiency improvements, that is to say, improvements in our ability to wring more work out of every bit of energy to produce more bang for the buck, improvements in energy efficiency stalled. Why did they stall? Because energy's cheap. And when energy's cheap, people don't care about wasting it, right? People are people. Rising coal use, flat energy efficiency, and all of this happened, and greenhouse gas emissions rose as a result, and that happened despite the fact that 2017 was a banner year for renewable energy. Okay, so we're going to come back to all of that. I think that announcement from the IEA is a pretty neat encapsulation of where the world is in terms of energy and the environment, at least as it relates to climate change. And I think Saturday, in marches around in Greenville, and my daughter was in one in San Francisco, and they happened in Japan and all over Europe, and I think that tells us that we better not assume that we know what's going to happen. Okay? So now we're going to move on. I want to do 3 things over the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes. I want to just deconstruct with a couple of slides. I cannot stand slides, but I'm going to show you a couple of them because I don't know a better way to kind of throw some information at you and make sure that we're all on the same page. I want to tell you where I think we are in the fight against climate change and why. And where we are is not very far. And why is because it's really hard. That's one reason. I want to take you inside the race that is developing to try to solve some of this stuff, but more than the race to try to solve some of this stuff, it's the race to harness the attempt to solve this to make money. It's a race to make money that happens to be about climate change. And I'm going to do that in a very self-indulgent way. I'm actually going to read you some of what I've written. And then I want to say a couple of things to those of you who are under 25 in this room about what you might do with all of this. Okay? So here we go. I don't know how to operate this. Okay, there we go. So where are we in the fight against climate change? Many of you may have seen a map like this. This happens to come from the IEA. This is 2 years old, but it's basically not changed much. So the black line is, this is global carbon dioxide emissions. I was a history major. I avoided science classes in college very stupidly in retrospect. I avoided them like the plague, but I think I'm capable of telling you the following. The black line are carbon dioxide emissions globally, and what do you see? You see they have risen, right? So long before 1990, since the mid-1700s, the world's economy has been a function of the consumption of fossil fuel, and the consumption of fossil fuel emits carbon dioxide. And so if you were to trace that line back, you'd see the line having sloped up over 150 or 200 years. Anyway, this is the last 20 years or so. The line goes up. And consider this. Can you hear me? You can hear me still. Consider this sort of the present. We're now a year or two old, but it's basically the same. So look at the red, blue, and green line. So follow me. I'm not going to throw a lot of numbers and jargon at you, but I want to do it right now. So has everyone heard of 2 degrees? 2 degrees means something in the context of climate change. So here's what scientists, I'm not one, but here's what scientists tell us. If we continue to consume stuff at the rate at which we are consuming stuff, and thereby pumping a lot of carbon dioxide into the environment as the result of our consumption of stuff, we will sufficiently pad the atmosphere with carbon dioxide that we will block reflection of the sun's heat and therefore raise the temperature of the Earth more than 2 degrees above where the Earth's temperature was prior to the Industrial Revolution. And the scientists tell us that if we do that, if we cross that threshold, that 2 degrees threshold, bad things are going to happen. And in fact, there was a climate conference in Paris, you may remember, in 2015, and what Paris said was we should avoid 2 degrees, but even more than that, we should avoid 1.5 degrees. So let's go back to the chart. This is according to the IEA, not according to Jeff Ball. The red line is where we're going if we continue to do what we're doing. Current policies. The blue line is where we go if we get pretty aggressive in policies. The green line is where we go if we actually do something about this problem. Okay? So I just want you to understand, if we did the green line, everything about your life would be different. What you are wearing would differ, what you're driving would differ, how frequently you're driving, how frequently you're flying, excuse my French, damn sure would differ. What's maybe not in South Carolina what's powering these lights would differ, because there's a lot of nuclear energy in South Carolina, which is essentially zero carbon. But we would be doing what we do with different kinds of things, and we would be doing different things too. There's no indication that the world is anywhere near the green line. Now, so let me just say one more thing about the Paris Climate Conference. There was a lot of self-congratulation around the time of the Paris Climate Conference. Why? Because everyone said the nations of the world came together, and for the first time, not just the developed countries of the world, but the developing countries of the world, China and India and Latin America and Africa, they ponied up and pledged that they too were going to seek to curb their emissions. Excellent, wonderful, we're all a big happy family, and we're going to solve this problem. 2 points. If the world does everything that the world pledged pledged in Paris that it would do. And by the way, there is absolutely no indication that that's happening. Countries are failing already to do what they said in Paris that they would do. But if they somehow turn around and do it, the world's still not going to be anywhere near a trajectory to avoid a 2 degrees world. So there's very, very little reason to think, and most scientists say we're effectively beyond the 2 degrees point already. So I know I've thoroughly brought you down, but I want to have a reality check about where we are. That is the challenge. Okay, not many more charts.
Yeah. Before you move, how does the 2 degree?
What does it mean on these lines? Yeah, good, it's a great question. But basically the green line's a 2 degree world. Okay, so I mean in really rough terms, right? Okay. All right. Now, so this is what the scientists tell us we have to do. But again, we're not living in an academic world. We're living in a real world. So it matters not just what we have to do, but who has to do it. So we just had a wonderful meal next door, and we're sitting in an air-conditioned room in a beautiful building in Greenville, South Carolina, and I'm wearing a cotton shirt that's been ironed, and I'm feeling pretty good about myself. And I'm in the green there. So here's the point. I don't really matter that much, and neither do you. And neither does this country matter that much in terms of dealing with climate change. So this is, if we were to go to that green line, See that wedge between sort of the red line and sort of the green line? Here's what the world would have to do. Who has to do the heavy lifting? China. And who else? And who else? India, right? Basically, it's the developing world. It is not the West. It's the countries, it's the poorest countries. Now, China is relatively wealthy among developing countries, right? But it is the countries that, broadly speaking, are least equipped to do this, that are going to have to do the most, or at least that are going to have to do the most, and by the way, probably are going to feel the effects of this the most too. So I want particularly students among you to kind of open your minds and have a sense of who's playing in this game, okay? All right, now, one other point. Climate change, I think it's really important to understand, is the mother of all hard environmental issues. Why? Two reasons. One of the reasons has to do with effects, and one of the reasons has to do with causes. The world has a pretty good record of dealing with environmental problems and with affecting energy transitions when it feels a crisis. Some of you will remember that in the 1960s, Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland was on fire. Some of you will remember that in the 1970s, the air above Los Angeles was fetid and yellow and disgusting and causing respiratory problems, if not cancer. Some of you will remember or have read that prior to the 1970s, France got most of its electricity by burning oil. Today, Cleveland's Cuyahoga River is not on fire. LA's air is pretty clean, and France gets most of its electricity from essentially zero carbon nuclear energy. Why did all those things happen? Cleveland decided it was not okay in a major American city to have a river on fire. LA decided it was not okay in a major American city to have kids dying because of respiratory disease. France looked at, in 1973, at the Arab oil embargo and did a collective mon Dieu, a collective, oh my God, our economy may come to a screeching halt and therefore we need to do something real. Or there's going to be economic collapse. And so France shifted to nuclear energy. Now, what's going on in China today? Who's been to China? I should have put in here a picture of the skyline in Beijing, but you've probably all seen that picture, right? The air in Beijing often looks like or worse than the air looked 40 years ago in Los Angeles. Longitudinal studies of cancer rates, particularly in young Chinese children, are starting to come out, and they are horrific. If any of you who had the pleasure of growing up in the United States were instead growing up in Beijing, you'd either have to breathe that stuff every day, or if you were lucky enough to be born to parents who could afford it, they would not let you go outside more than a day a week. True. Or they would invest in special air filtration equipment in your house or apartment so that you didn't have to breathe inside the stuff that's outside. It is really difficult to overstate the extent of the crisis that's happening in terms of clean air and dirty air in China right now. And it's the reason I've said to every class I've talked to at Furman, and I'm going to say it to you all, you must go to China. Is Kate in the room? Kate's not, okay. But you must go to China. There are great opportunities for you at Furman to go to China and to go to other places that are relevant to the world. Look, I say this as excuse me, and I hope, are there any French teachers in the room? Okay. I say this as someone who loves France, whose daughter just got back from a 6-month study abroad program in France. Don't go to France. Go to China and India. That's what you need to learn about, okay? Anyway, so China's doing something about it. I think China's attempt to clean up China's air, which is going on right now, which is the result of extraordinarily aggressive policies, and we shall see the extent to which they are enforced. China's attempt to clean up China's air is going to go down in history, if it works, as one of the greatest environmental victories the world has ever seen. Now, if it works. But the scale of the attempt is huge. Okay, so I'm rambling here, but Cleveland, LA, and France and China. My suggestion to you is that they did or are doing what they're doing because they felt a palpable crisis. No one needed to debate whether there was a crisis. Where am I going with this? I don't think we think of climate change as a crisis. And I'm going to show you in a second some polling that bears that out. You may consider yourself an environmentalist, but you have to think hard to connect the dots about making climate change a crisis. And many of you in this room are here because you're connecting those dots. But most people outside this room are not connecting those dots. And I think that goes a long way toward explaining why we're not doing more than we're doing on climate change. I don't think it is mostly the big bad oil companies and big bad coal companies. I think it is mostly us. Okay. That's the effect. The effects are hard to see. What about the causes? I'm going to be really quick here. Air pollution is relatively scientifically easy to solve, and there are some people in this room, I think, or at least whose classes I've been in, who are much more expert in this than I am, but we kind of know how to crack that nut. Solving climate change is just a radically different order of magnitude. It's a different kind of problem, and I won't bore you with the science, but the production of carbon dioxide is tied up in every single thing, almost every single thing we do. So going to that green line rather than the red line, as I said, is going to be a radical transformation of the global economy, the likes of which we've never seen. It's really hard. Okay. Let me now take you inside the attempt to do something about all this. Okay? Oh, actually, before I do that, let me just show you this. So we talked about China and India as being so look, this is the Pew Research Center, which is, to my mind, a pretty objective research institute based in Washington. This is a couple of years old because it's the most recent time they've polled globally this intensively, but there is more recent information, and broadly, in terms of the point I'm going to make, it's somewhat similar. You can get this online, Google Pew and climate change. What does this tell you? So this is basically to what extent do people care about climate change in different countries, and Furman students among you, what does it tell you? Speak up. Who particularly doesn't care? Indeed, indeed. The U.S. and China are the world's biggest carbon dioxide emitters, and they're at the bottom. They're at the bottom of the column in terms of professed concern about climate change. Why might Latin America and Africa be at the top? Indeed, they're getting affected. Okay. So I've been to a bunch of these global confabs on climate change, many of which, well, I just was telling you that Paris, I think, didn't do much. And Paris is the one that everyone says did a lot. This is why they don't do anything. Because the rich countries don't want to pay, and the poor countries that are real and aren't very concerned about it, and the poor countries that are quite concerned about it don't have the financial wherewithal to do it. And so we get into a kind of a tit for tat and a question of who pays. And by the way, the money that we're talking about in terms of government aid for climate change is laughably small in the context of the amount of money that is being spent and will be spent on energy. And I won't bore you with the numbers, but we have to amp this up. If you walk out of here believing that you care about this stuff, you have to ask people to be serious, not to sort of talk in funny numbers. Okay. This is just to point out that climate change is more politically polarized than ever in the United States. So this is just people who say they believe humans are causing climate change, Democrats and Republicans. Again, not my information, Pew's information, but in 2016 you see the spread is greater than the spread 10 years before. So if you believe, if everyone thought that climate change was a cataclysmic issue that we all needed to join together to do something about, you would think that those blue and red lines would come together, right? They're not coming together, they're going apart. Okay, so let's just do Energy 101. I'm taking way too much time. Let me do this really quickly. So this is the last data slide. This is how we this is where we get our energy. This is not just electricity. This is energy, which means it includes, in addition to the stuff that makes electricity, it includes the stuff that makes our cars go, planes go, trains go, largely oil. So you see coal is brown, oil is black, and gas, natural gas, is gray. And you see nuclear, big in South Carolina, in blue, and bioenergy, which is basically burning stuff that's natural, grass, wood, or in much of the world, poop, animal excrement, which is burned not just to produce electricity, but to produce a lot of the world's heat. And then you see the stuff that we all think is lovely and pretty, which is the orange stuff, which is largely solar and wind. Okay, solar and wind and maybe geothermal, some other stuff. Anyway, bottom line here, what does it tell you? It tells you that fossil fuels account for the vast majority of our energy today. And these are three scenarios of what the energy future might be in 2040. All of them envision 2040, so that is essentially 25 years from now. But these are three different versions of what the world might look like, basically depending on the aggressiveness of government policy. How green does government policy get? Now, I'll take another minute and a half on this. You see a couple of differences here, right? You see that the slices The percentages in each slice differ in the three different worlds, but you also see radical differences in the sizes of the pie. Why might that be? Because if we get much greener, we're going to be consuming less. We're going to be doing more work with less energy. So it's really important that you realize that the solution to this stuff is not just a bunch of solar panels and wind turbines. The solution is getting smarter about how we use energy regardless of how that energy is produced so that we do more work with less of it. Right? So that the solar and the wind and the other wonderful stuff has to carry less of a burden. Okay, so anyway, but just understand that what this is telling you is that the greatest minds in the world have no idea how this is going to play out, how the future is going to look for the stuff that runs our economy. And so who knows what happens, but I also just want to point one thing out because I'm going to go and talk for a few minutes about renewable energy. So in none of these scenarios do you see renewable energy anywhere near a majority, even under the most aggressive scenarios. Now, I will tell you, there are other people who would come in here and tell you this is bunk. This is a bunch of conservative hooey, and renewables can power 100% of electricity. There are people who will tell you that. But there is also, we're going from 2% of renewables, of other renewables, because that excludes hydro, dams, which is renewable energy as well, but it's sort of traditional stuff. So to go from 2% today to 5% of an even bigger pie, or 6% of essentially the same pie, or 14% even of a smaller pie, won't solve the climate problem, but it will be a hell of an economic transformation. It will make a lot of money for some people. It will lose a lot of money for other people. I dare say some of you in this room have invested in this stuff, and some of you may have done well, and some of you may have done really badly. I see both around me in Silicon Valley. So what I want to talk to you about for 2 more minutes, and then I'll be quiet, is basically that race. So I want to just read you. I was going to read you 3 things, but I'm going to read you 1 thing. I'm going to read you maybe 2 things. So I was going to read you pieces. So I've spent a lot of time basically flying around the world and doing kind of long-form narrative pieces about this race to solve this stuff. And I've been to a bunch of countries, and I think I'm going to read you, do you want to hear about Germany, or do you want to hear about Saudi Arabia, or do you want to hear about Shell, the biggest oil company in the world? Raise your hand if you want to hear about Germany. Who cares about Germany? Raise your hand if you want to hear about Saudi Arabia. And raise your hand if you want to hear about Shell. All right, so we're going to do Saudi Arabia and Shell real quick, okay? Can I take a couple extra minutes? Is that okay? And then, all right, so this is really self-indulgent of me, but I will tell you, I figured I was going to try to describe to you this, and then I realized I spent a lot of time actually trying to write this stuff. So let me try to talk to you about this in the context which is most important to me. So I wrote a piece in The Atlantic, which was published in July 2015, for which I spent 10 days in Saudi Arabia reporting. I had never been to Saudi Arabia. It's an amazingly fascinating country, and it will not surprise you to know that it's a slightly large oil producer. And here's the title of the piece: Why the Saudis Are Going Solar. The fate of one of the biggest fossil fuel producers may now depend on its investment in renewable energy. So I'm going to read you a few paragraphs. If it gets really painful and you want me to stop, just raise your hand and cry, uncle. So that was Germany. Prince Turki bin Saud bin Mohammed Al Saud belongs to the family that rules Saudi Arabia. He wears a white tob and gutra, the traditional robe and headdress of Arab men, and he has a cavernous office hung with portraits of 3 Saudi royals. When I visited him in Riyadh this spring, which was the spring of 2015, a waiter poured tea and subordinates took notes as Turki spoke. Everything about the man seemed to suggest Western notions of a complacent functionary in a complacent, oil-rich kingdom. But Turkey doesn't fit the stereotype, and neither does his country. Quietly, the prince is helping Saudi Arabia, the quintessential petrostate, prepare to make what could be one of the world's biggest investments in solar power. Quote, "We have a clear interest in solar energy," Turkey told me, "and soon it will be expanding exponentially in the kingdom." Saudi Arabia produces much of its electricity by burning oil, a practice that most countries abandoned long ago, reasoning that they could use coal and natural gas instead and save oil for transportation, an application for which there is no mainstream alternative, even with Elon Musk right now, I would tell you. Most of Saudi Arabia's power plants are colossally inefficient, as are its air conditioners, which consumed 70% of the kingdom's electricity in 2013. Although the kingdom has just 30 million people, it is the world's 6th largest consumer of oil. Now Saudi rulers say things must change. Their motivation isn't concern about global warming. The last thing they want is an end to the fossil fuel era. Quite the contrary, they see investing in solar energy as a way to remain a global oil power. The Saudis burn about a quarter of the oil they produce, and their domestic consumption has been rising at an alarming 7% a year, nearly 3 times the rate of population growth. According to a widely read December 2011 report by Chatham House, a British think tank, stay with me here, if this trend continues, domestic consumption could eat into Saudi oil exports by 2021 and render the kingdom a net oil importer by 2038. One more paragraph. That outcome would be cataclysmic for Saudi Arabia. The kingdom's political stability has long rested on the, quote, ruling bargain, whereby the royal family provides citizens who pay no personal income taxes with extensive social services funded by oil exports. Left unchecked, domestic consumption could also limit the nation's ability to moderate global oil prices through its swing reserve, the extra petroleum it can pump to meet spikes in global demand. If Saudi rulers want to maintain control at home and preserve their power on the world stage, they must find a way to use less oil. Solar, they have decided, is the obvious alternative. Saudi's not going solar because it cares about the planet, or at least not mainly because it cares about the planet. I'm sure there are plenty of people in Saudi Arabia who do, but it's a financial proposition. Okay, can I take 2 more minutes and read you this thing about Shell, and then I'll stop? So, I have a piece that's actually in Fortune on newsstands now. And it looks at what Shell, which is the world's largest oil company by sales, is doing to diversify its portfolio. And I want to read you a couple of paragraphs, and then I'm going to stop. Last March, Royal Dutch Shell said it was selling most of its stake in Canada's oil sands, a vast project that has extracted millions of barrels of sticky, gooey hydrocarbons from the ground in a process that resembles mining more than drilling. The oil and gas giant announced that it was unloading its oil sands assets for $7.25 billion so that it could double down on business where we have global scale and a competitive advantage. Left unsaid was a deeper reason for the divestiture. Months of deliberations behind closed doors at Shell headquarters in The Hague, Netherlands, had led top brass at the world's largest non-state-owned oil company by sales to conclude that the energy industry was changing fundamentally in a way that could turn the profitable oil sands operation into a liability. Internal studies by a group of analysts within Shell known as the Scenarios team had concluded that global demand for oil might peak. Global demand for oil might peak in as little as a decade, essentially tomorrow, in an industry that plans in quarter-century increments. Hastening the peak was an onslaught of increasingly competitive fossil fuel alternatives, from solar and wind power to electric cars, whose prices were dropping far faster than Shell executives had expected. When the oil demand peak came, Shell believed, petroleum prices might begin a slow slide, dipping too low to cover the cost of oil sands production. 2 or 3 more paragraphs, and then I'll stop. This would not be just another oil price cycle, a familiar roller coaster in which every down is followed by an up. It would be the start of a decades-long decline of the oil age itself, an uncharted world in which, in a phrase gaining currency at Shell, oil prices might be lower forever. I apologize for what I'm about to read. If that scenario materialized and you were stuck holding the oil sands, Jeremy Bentham, the head of Shell's Scenarios team, tells me, reprising in his British lilt the gist of a memo he wrote to his boss not long before the company decided on the sale, you were, forgive me, fucked. Shell, a cash machine that racked up $9 billion in profit in the first 9 months of 2017, a colossus that employs 90,000 people in more than 70 countries, a corporation that, were it a nation, would have the world's 7th largest carbon footprint behind Germany, and the number 7 company on Fortune's 500 list last year with $240 billion in sales, is in an existential squeeze. It is concluded that oil demand is likely to peak sometime between the late 2020s and the late 2040s because of an epic shift underway in the energy industry, a transition from petroleum to electricity. And it goes on to talk about the implications of that. So I'm going to stop. I apologize for going over. I just want to leave you, particularly those who are students among you, with the notion that we're not just talking sort of academically, and we're not just sort of talking politically, ideologically about the green stuff. And it's not just me telling you this. You have the CEO of Shell telling you that his entire business model, the model of one of the world's largest corporations, is under siege. And if I were to continue on, and I won't put you to sleep by doing that, but what he would tell you in these quotes is, we are not going to be sitting ducks. That's his quote. We are not going to be sitting ducks. So he is engaged in this massive, massive, furious peddling to ensure that he saves his company. And by the way, when he became CEO a few years ago, he did not think this was going to have to be his problem. It just sort of crept up on him. Okay. Can I just take one, I just want to say one thing to the students, because I thought a little bit about what I wanted to say about what you might do about this. And I came up with 5 things. Read, go, ask, listen, and do. Read. Read every day. Don't just read what the Google algorithm tells you. Read everything you can get your hands on. Read things you think you'd never want to read because they'll surprise you, they'll teach you, they'll anger you, they'll inspire you. And when you're done reading them, read some more. Go. Getting alerts from your Facebook and Instagram feeds is no substitute for seeing the world. An airplane is an infinitely more wonderful device than an iPhone. Get out of your comfort zone and go. Go to the place that is as different from what you know as you can imagine. And when you get there, don't go to McDonald's. Go where the locals go and get to know them. Ask. Ask hard questions, the ones that others are afraid to ask. Often you won't get a straight answer. So keep asking. Listen. Too many people talk, not enough people listen. After you've read, after you've gone, after you've asked, give some thought to this as your default strategy. Keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth closed. Do. Do your thing. For me, that thing is writing. Figure out what it is for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. That was wonderful. We have time for a few questions. I have to make one announcement for those of you who don't know about our Cultural Life program, our CLP program. It is a requirement for graduation for our students. And this, as a CLP activity, is one of those activities that meets that requirement. And therefore, I must give first preference to our students who are asking questions because this is part of their education here at Furman. So I apologize to our community members if you end up not being able to ask the question that you wanted to ask. So hands up.
On to Furman.
Hands up, and we'll take our first question.
That's Shell's CEO. I forgot to use the clicker. Okay.
Okay. Yes, right here.
So you talked about how the countries that are not able to handle climate change are the ones who basically need it the most. So where do you think the compromise lies between countries helping developing nations and ensuring that they're sustainable in their development?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I'm going to answer this really quickly, but this could be a 30-minute discussion. I don't think there's any evidence that the wealthy countries of the world are willing to philanthropically give anywhere near as much money as it would require, and I'm not actually sure they're capable of giving. So this is, in my estimation, not going to be a giving game. This is going to be a making money game. This is all about not defeating capitalism, but harnessing capitalism. So this is about government doing what government can do to steer the flow of money toward the green stuff, not the brown stuff, not the gray stuff. And so I think that, number one, what wealthy countries can do is, in terms of their domestic politics, promulgate policies that create economic incentives for private money, which at the end of the day is going to be way more important than public money, for private money to go into this. And we could have a long conversation about what are smart incentives and what are dumb incentives. There are a lot of dumb incentives in this country and in other countries. So that's one thing. The only other thing I would say is, remember I made the point about my sense that historically countries have moved, places have moved when they felt in a crisis. I would say that they were pushed. They felt pushed. And what I said to you is I don't think the world feels a crisis about climate change. Maybe Latin America and Africa do, but they're politically not powerful enough at this point to persuade the rest of the world. And I actually am not sure, I'm not sure that it's that pervasively felt there yet either. So I don't think that a push is going to work on climate change. There are a lot of people, particularly in environmental organizations, particularly on the left, who are screaming as loud as they can scream to try to create a push. More power to them. I don't think there's any evidence that it's worked. So, I'm rambling. I think that what we need to do is create a pull. We need to be really, really, really economically efficient and smart to drive down the costs of the green stuff so that the green stuff is more attractive than the gray stuff on cost alone or on attributes unrelated to climate change. It's convenience, it's cost, whatever. I don't know if we can do that, but I think that needs to be the game.
Another question?
Other student questions?
Right here.
So you talked about we have to make the green stuff more affordable. How do you think we do that? Because, I mean, obviously Teslas aren't affordable. Solar panels aren't real affordable. Like, how do we market the green stuff so that it becomes more affordable so that more people can use it, especially in those developing countries?
Yeah, that is the question. That is the question, and I will attempt quickly to address it, but if you're really interested, I'm really glad you asked it. I hope a lot of you are interested in it, and you should do some reading. You have really great professors here who are teaching classes relevant to that, and there is just reams of information about this, and you should dig in. If you're looking for a senior thesis or senior essay, there are many, many, many of them in this question. So how do you make the green stuff cheaper? So first of all, it is happening. Solar panel prices are better than 80% cheaper than they were 5 or 10 years ago. The prices have crashed. Similar things have happened with wind turbines. And that actually, well, let me not go there. So prices have come down a lot. They have not come down anywhere near where they need to come down. So solar is now 1% of global electricity. Less than 1% of global energy, despite massive growth in solar. And so if solar is going to register as a material contributor to reducing carbon emissions, it's going to have to be well north of 1%. And in order for that to happen, it's going to need to be way cheaper than it is. So there are a lot of things we can do. We can, first of all, invest more heavily in R&D. And R&D often is the first thing to go when budgets get cut. You can bet that China is investing heavily in R&D. We should invest in R&D. We can realize as a country and as policymakers that the game here is not to beat China. The game here is to understand that China is a major player in this globalizing enterprise that is clean energy, and we acknowledge that, and we got to build our policies around leveraging the role of China rather than trying to forget the role of China or erase it. And there's lots to say there, but there's a lot about our policy and the protectionism of our policy that I think is misguided, not just misguided to the planet, but misguided to our domestic economy. I think that trying to beat China in stupid ways ends up coming actually back to hurt us in our domestic pocketbook. Forget about hurting the planet. We can do things to make the gray stuff relatively more expensive. We can tax gasoline much more than we're taxing gasoline. Anyone been to Europe lately? What did you pay for a liter, or when you convert it into a gallon, what did you pay for a gallon of gasoline in the UK? $8 maybe, right? So I'm in California where gasoline's really expensive. It's like I paid $3.60. It's like, what is it, $2.40 here, something like that, right? So the difference between the price of gasoline in California and among the price in Greenville in California and the UK is not the price of oil. A barrel is a barrel is a barrel. The difference is tax. And so if we really are serious about it, we can tax gasoline more heavily. But what are you going to say when you have to pay $8 a gallon for gasoline? No thanks, right? So again, it's not just the big bad oil companies, it's us. Anyway, lots of things we can do.
Jackson.
So sort of to piggyback off of that, earlier you talked about efficiency doesn't grow as fast when the source is cheap. And so with renewables getting as cheap as they are, how do you also incentivize energy efficiency to increase at the same pace to get to the point where we're using less energy, not just using better sources of energy?
Yeah, it is, again, like a really great question, a really, really complicated issue. So let me just kind of try to bend your mind with a couple of points. We talked about this in one of the classes that I was in Jeffrey's class, Habron's class yesterday. There actually has been academic substantiation of the notion that when energy efficiency improves, people use more energy. If you drive a Prius rather than driving an Escalade, and therefore you pay less per mile, you're likely to drive more miles. So energy efficiency is not an unmitigatedly good thing in terms of climate change. It's not at all clear that it gets us anywhere near where we need to go. But it's clearly better not to waste energy than it is to waste energy, right? So one thing we can do is we can make energy more expensive to create an economic incentive to waste it less. We can legislate. So there are standards in much of the world. There are in the United States. In California, they tend to be much more rigorous than, say, in South Carolina. Standards for how energy efficient a house needs to be when it's built. Standards for energy efficiency of cars. The reason that cars are a lot more energy efficient now, fuel efficient than they used to be, is because California took Detroit to the mat and forced Detroit to build more efficient cars and therefore raised the cost of cars. Let's be clear, there's no free lunch. And then other states and the federal government followed. So you can legislate more energy efficient things. Your iPhone, refrigerators, cars, buildings, universities, yada yada, light bulbs, right? Okay. There is a view that you can increase consciousness of the sort of environmental effect of wasting energy and that people will be sort of shamed into using less. I'd be interested in your view about whether that works. I'm not telling you it doesn't, because it may be, I think I see in my 14 and 16-year-old daughter an awful lot more consciousness about not wasting energy than I had when I was 14 or 16. I'm not sure that's enough to do it.
Yes, right here.
Yeah, I was just wondering what factors you think might be holding us back from maybe following like France's, what they've done in the past with going more towards nuclear?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I am not the expert. I'll say two things. I'm not the expert on South Carolina politics, but I'm very intrigued by them. And you have a fascinating live example in front of you about the politics of nuclear energy, right? I don't think I need to say more to this crowd, right? So you're a really interesting test case. I don't mean you, I mean your state, this state. Okay, so let's go back to what I said about France. Why did France go nuclear? France went nuclear not because it cared about climate change, not because it wanted to save the trees, but because it thought the lights were going to go off when the lights were powered by burning oil. Here's why we're not doing it. Well, one other thing. By the way, we started doing nuclear energy in this country around the same time. The nuclear plants, the nuclear build in this country began also in about the mid-1970s in a big way, mid to late 1970s. We just did it much less efficiently than France did it. And France did it efficiently because France had a more centralized government, which some people like and some people really don't like. But France basically did cookie-cutter nuclear plants around the landscape. We sort of did it in a kind of way. And so we didn't do cookie cutters. We did a bunch of one-offs. And so they broke. And when they broke, it was really expensive to fix each one. I actually did a story at the Wall Street Journal where I spent about a week and a half in France writing a deeply reported piece about nuclear in France. And by the way, at the time in France when the Arab oil embargo happened, who speaks French in this room? Excellent. So people of a certain age in France remember a public service announcement on French TV. On n'a pas de pétrole, mais on a des idées. What does that mean? We don't have oil, we have ideas. And the ideas were we're going to get off oil, right? So that was nuclear. Why didn't we do it in this country? So we tried to do it, but we did it kind of in a way. I'm thinking of saying something other than but I won't. And we didn't do a very good job of it. But here's why we're not doing it now. Because what happened in the energy world in the United States over the last 5 to 7 years? Coal prices tanked? Oil prices. Why did oil prices tank? Why was there more? Shale. We discovered a lot of oil and gas in this country. We are actually now exporting oil and gas, right? That's why we're not doing nuclear, because we are swimming in domestic fossil fuel. So let me make one other quick point. That's why we're not doing nuclear, because we don't need nuclear. If your concern is energy security, we are totally effectively energy secure right now in this country. Now, many of you can push back and say that that's a kind of fool's notion, that it's not going to last forever, and you may well be right. But there's a general perception in the populace now that we are energy secure and we don't need to experiment with any of this other really expensive stuff. That, by the way, is actually a really important impediment for renewables, for wind and solar. Because 10 years ago, you could make the case, and many environmentalists did, that you wanted to push wind and solar even if you didn't care about the environment. Even if you just wanted American energy, homegrown energy, you push wind and solar. Well, now you don't need wind and solar if what you want is homegrown energy, because we're swimming in homegrown fossil fuel. So that's why we're not doing more of it.
Okay, we can open the floor to our professors, our OLLI members, and our community members for the last few questions. I'll take a student question over here. There you are. Go ahead.
So you showed the one graph with like the Democrats and the Republicans and their view on how climate change is affecting our world. And so I was wondering if you had like any ideas about how to make the question or the issue of climate change in our country not a question of party affiliation, but a question of global and national importance.
A question of global and national what?
Importance.
Importance. Yeah, I mean, look, I don't. The extent to which climate change is polarized in a partisan way is really anomalous in the United States. There is not this, there's certainly not the extent of partisan polarization over this issue in most other countries. Now, so just to be clear, there may be greater concern about climate change and there may be less concern about climate change in other places, but it doesn't seem to divide based on party lines so much. So a couple of things. I think one reason for that is it can remain a religious issue in this country, I mean religious in a political sense, because we don't feel the effects of it. So there's no kind of fire under our rear end to do anything about it. And because, well, basically because of that. So what do we do about it? That's a really good question. What do we do about it, Jeff? I mean, one thing that we could do about it is see the effects of it. But by the time we see the effects of it in a way that registers with many people in this country, it will be largely too late. Or at least for some things, it'll be too late. Look, again, I go back to the answer that I gave earlier about the push and the pull. I think what we try to do is sell. I mean, I'm actually not in the business of selling anything. I mean, I think if you are concerned about climate change, the best strategy to get the world, the United States particularly, to do something about climate change is to create the pull rather than work on creating the push. That is to say, do the things that are smart to make economic and make attractive in non-environmental ways other than economics the stuff you want.
Gentleman in the blue jacket, you've been very patient. Thank you.
You talk about politics, and of course, I'm also a congressional candidate running for Congress right now. I work with somebody who actually authored the bill that Senator Merkley introduced a few years ago from Oregon, the 100 by 50, 100% clean energy by 2050. When JFK said we're going to put a man on the moon, innovation happened. When we say we're going to do an idea like 100% clean energy by 2050, innovation will happen. How do we get the commercial sector to agree to this? And two, how do we get our states to do this when, like, it's been written that South Carolina, if we went 100% clean energy, we'd have 100,000 jobs, career jobs created in the state?
Okay, so let me, before I try to take a stab at actually answering your question, let me do what I'm really good at, is like stalling, and then I'll come and try to answer your question. I want to just pick apart two assumptions in your question. One is the notion of clean energy, and one is, I guess, the notion of 100%. So clean energy is in the eye of the beholder. And if you look at different definitions of, I'm not trying to be cute here, I just want to point out something I think is important, particularly for students who are thinking people to understand. Different states, different countries around the world and different states in the United States define clean energy differently. Is nuclear clean? I would dare say in South Carolina, nuclear is considered clean, at least if you're running for something in South Carolina. Is nuclear clean in California? It's probably not. Probably not considered clean. And that applies to natural gas. Okay, so let me just make one other point. Is solar clean? So just to drive home the point, solar is clean in a carbon sense, but if you've grown up in a landscape in a desert in Southern California, and you value the local ecology, and solar panel farms that go for miles are going to be built and you're concerned about them impeding the lives of the desert tortoise, is solar clean? I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to answer the question. I just want you to ask the question. So what people consider clean it differs. I think the notion of 100% zero carbon energy, this is essentially what Germany's trying to do. We don't have time to go into the bowels of what Germany's trying to do. Germany has made extraordinary progress toward this goal, and there's a political backlash in Germany. There's a political backlash in terms of the cost of this. And there is actually a political pullback now in terms of aggressiveness in Germany. I'm not here to cheer that or to criticize that. I just want you to understand what's happening on the ground. So I think two things. I think we are surprising ourselves as a world in how possible it is to ramp up clean energy. There were people who said bad things would happen, blackouts would happen when we surpassed 5% renewables, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is bunk. I mean, Germany and other places have shown, California's shown that that's bunk, but that's a far cry from 100%. So there is a lot of technology that has to happen between here and 100%. And your question was how do we get people to do 100%? I mean, again, I think the answer is money. What you do is you make the stuff you want much cheaper. And you maybe make the stuff you don't want more expensive. But I can't give you a pat answer because my read of history is that we don't feel that this issue is sufficiently problematic, we the populace, to make the stuff that you don't want more expensive. And there's some technological work that still needs to happen to make the stuff that you do want cleaner.
Right here.
I was kind of hoping you were going to make this a circular conversation. Sorry. I was kind of hoping you were going to make this a circular conversation from your first discussion of the marches last Saturday and how people pouring into the streets and a wave.
Yeah.
See, for me, I agree with some of what you say, but not all of it, because I think that climate change is the great moral issue of our time. Mm-hmm. And like in the 60s, it was civil rights. Well, guess what? This issue is going to touch every single person and every single thing on the planet. What greater moral issue? So people are, 3 words for you: Irma, Maria, and Harvey. Fires in California.
Storms.
So, fires and storms. So what's happening is, as the economic cost of climate change rises, forget like the human cost, or let's think about the human cost. People are going to pour in the streets. It's a military issue. Look what has happened with Syria. The drought in Syria, the 100-year drought that sent the people into the capital, destabilized an already unstable situation. Those 4 million refugees poured across Europe, probably contributed to Brexit, made Angela Merkel's life a little bit unhappy in Germany. So all of this,
is happening.
Yeah, it's happening. It is happening now. And so let's hope subsidies come on the scene to engender some of that push or pull you're talking about. But see, I'm ready to march in the streets. And I think it's going to take, this is not real popular maybe at Furman, but nonviolent civil disobedience. I think it's going to people, like in the 60s, they did not achieve civil rights by writing letters to the editor. They did sit-ins, even here in Greenville, right? And they said, have you ever seen those? Those are really ugly.
Huh?
Yeah.
I mean,
No, but
look,
I mean, I've
look.
taken
Okay,
the
can I jump in a
arrest
second?
me,
Yeah.
you know?
So look, you have eloquently made a really important point, and many of you in the audience may agree with it, and many of you in the audience may vehemently disagree with it. But you needed to hear it, and I think it's a really interesting conversation to start. But let me say two things. One of which is what I wanted to say in response to you, but it relates to you. You talked about the Manhattan Project. You talked about a moral push. I actually think that climate change is infinitely harder than the Manhattan Project. I think it's really important to understand this. Why did we do a Manhattan Project? Because we felt like our existence was threatened. The space race, right. We felt like Russia was going to eat our lunch in a kind of an existential way. The Soviet Union was. I'm telling you, I'm not advocating a point here. I'm just telling you, I don't think most people think of climate change in the existential terms in which you describe them. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just telling you, I think all of this polling data is hard to, it's hard to see this polling data and now. So that's one thing. I actually think particularly for you all, I think the Manhattan Project metaphor can be overused, and it's problematic because it's actually worse. It's harder than the Manhattan Project. Number two, as to a moral movement, did anyone hear about the Pope's climate encyclical a couple of years ago? So I recommend it to you. It's 92 pages. I've read it all. The Pope, or whoever writes for the Pope, writes really well. And you can read it in a weekend if you really care to. I'm serious. You actually should read it. It's pretty interesting as a window into the argument about climate change, and it's also really interesting as a window into the role of the Pope as a leader globally, a religious leader globally. I want to give you one anecdote. I was at a conference at Notre Dame in Indiana that was talking about climate change. I was on a panel there, and there was a nun. And we were talking, and she told me that she had seen churchgoers in Catholic churches around the United States studying the papal encyclical on climate change with more fervor than she had seen Catholics in the United States study anything except the Bible itself. That's interesting. Right? That suggests that there's something to what you're saying. That suggests that people, and it suggests that it happens when someone, a leader whom people respect, calls this out as a moral issue. I'm not qualified to predict for you whether this is going to come to be seen as a moral issue. I think the danger is that that by the time enough happens to persuade people that this is a moral issue, enough bad stuff on the ground happens, it's in some ways too late. Too much of a lot of climate change, some climate change, ladies and gentlemen, already is baked in. Like, this is not a matter of just sort of preventing climate change. Let's be very clear. We're living in an age of climate change. You particularly are going to be growing up in an age of climate change. The question is how much? Okay.
We have time for one last question right here.
Have the opportunity to influence the kinds of books that our store gets in, because we're very much a community committed store. This is Barnes & Noble. So my question to you is, for adults, we're already grown up, so we can do the go, see, listen, ask, and do, but in very different ways than the students here at Furman. Is there a website or books that you can recommend that I can bring to my bookstore?
Sure. I want to think about that a little bit, but I'll get your name afterwards, and I promise I'll send you an email.
And this can be children's books as well as adult books.
Yeah. Yeah, but I just want to make another point. I feel like I keep, like, as the school marm in the room, the guy with gray hair in the room, talking to you all in the corner all the time. And sorry, you all too. I apologize. They just have better red ties and shirts. It's really important to read widely. It is important not to sort of drink the verbal Kool-Aid, the written Kool-Aid, right? I mean, don't just read the stuff that validates the opinion that you think you have. Read the other stuff too. You owe it to yourself. But anyway, I promise, give me your email address and we'll talk, as they say. Yeah.
Jeffrey, thank you very
Thanks a
much
lot.
for a wonderful evening. Appreciate it.